So welcome back to Let's Get Moving podcast, guys. So this show is practically dedicated to taking a very deep evidence-based look at what is actually drives the performance and longevity in the gym and the weight room. And today we are talking about a topic that is very separates the truly optimized training performance with the basic stuff out there. So the intelligent integration of a single leg workout, also known as unilateral training. So for years now, the gold standard has been with the big workouts and compound lifts like squats, bench, deadlifts, and it is rightly to do so. But we all know that the human body rarely moves bilaterally in life or sport because we are running, we are jumping, we are throwing, we are rotating, and that's everything in unilateral basis. So if your training doesn't account for that unique stability with the asymmetry assessment and neurological demands of a single limb movement, I think you're leaving a significant amount of force production, also the injury resilience and athletic potential on the table. So I think we are going to dive much more deeper and exactly how we can use the unilateral training, not just as an accessory work, but also as a fundamental driver to our progressive overload in strength performance training. So in order to guide us through this very complex but also a crucial topic that I think it is, I'm delighted to welcome today a coach who truly lives at the intersection of strength training, science-based, and a real world application. So he's a very serious coach, strength and conditioning coach with a wealth of experience doing this such of periodization with elite athletes. So joining us today from Russia, but who lives at the moment in Kyrgyzstan and working as well. So Ivan ZAGORSKI. Ivan, thank you for making the time to join us to the show today.
Thank you very much for having me. Glad to be part of it.
Ivan, it's really fantastic to have you here. And like I said, it's really start, and I'm really thrilled to have you on the show. So let's just start with the pure basics. So for all of those people in the audience who are primarily focused on bilateral lifts, like the squats and like the deadlifts, how would you significantly like define the unilateral training, and what is the fundamental for you, like a non-negotiable reason that needs to sit on the table when it comes to this periodization model and series programming?
So when it comes to unilateral training, it is basically being able to load a single limb at a time, as opposed to, like you said, bilateral lifts. It could be a single arm or a single leg. But the real value there isn't so much in just loading a single limb. It's more about how the body is forced to coordinate those movements neurologically. So there is a lot of research showing, for example, that when you're working one limb, there's also some adaptations that are being driven to the non-working limb. And plus, if you look at just the basics of human locomotion, a lot of movement involves single arm, single leg. Like, for example, when you walk, it goes one arm forward, opposite leg back. So it's a lot of these kind of opposing cross movements that I think can also be trained very well through lateral training. And then if you apply that obviously to athletic performance, then a lot of the sporting movements as well involve moving off of one leg, cutting, sprinting, things like that.
Yes, I love the way you said it. And actually, that moves to my next question. So, we often hear the term of bilateral deficit. And can you break us down for our audience what this phenomenon is, and specifically how it informs your decision further on to move beyond just strictly bilateral movements and implicate more in unilateral training sessions into your workout routines, of course?
Yeah, so normally when you're talking about something complex like a human organism, you would expect everything to produce more than the sum of its parts. But when it comes to the
Yep.
bilateral strength deficit, a lot of times that is not the case. And, I've been delving into how the nervous system affects athletic performance a lot lately. And basically, even when you have the best intentions in mind, sometimes the nervous system can limit access to certain muscle groups, to certain limbs, because it doesn't feel that it is safe to put a certain amount of force into it. It would then offload work into other
Yeah.
limbs, into other structures, which can result in long-term imbalances. There is some research showing the benefits of bilateral work for improving each single limb, but I do believe more so in just isolating a specific body part to where it just can't hide, to really make sure that you're driving the adaptations to the maximum there.
Yes, yes. But let's give some advice for all of the coaches and maybe the lifters who are just bracing over like maybe 90% of the time to the squats and any other bilateral movements. So what specific cues of maybe like internal feedbacks should they be looking for to ensure that they are performing a quality unilateral repetition versus something when it just goes simply throughout the motion? So what separates for you a good lunge, for example, or any unilateral from just a great one?
Well, I think the most important part here is positioning. So, as the coach Jay Schroeder said, position is the key to velocity, velocity is the key to movement, and movement is the key to life. So, I want to
Yeah,
see people own the positions in any exercise to where they can pause in a position at any time, where they can get to as deep of a range as they possibly can without compromising posture and other aspects of technique. And generally can do the move at any tempo, but more importantly with maximum intent, which doesn't mean necessarily straining as much as possible and trying to muscle it, but making the movement
yeah.
almost seamless to where it's like regardless of how much weight they're using, the movement looks as if it's almost weightless.
Yeah, yeah, I see. So I love it. And for example, let's go a little bit beyond just the weight room for a moment. So the most humans and their movement, of course, like I said at the introduction, are in like unilateral form. So we are running, we are throwing, we are jumping, we are doing everything in this unilateral basis. So can you also a little bit more profoundly explain this biomechanical imperative for our integration to that single limb work? So how directly does a pistol squat or a Bulgarian split squat, or it doesn't matter, or a Romanian deadlift translates for you on the field when it comes to athleticism?
Well, I think a lot of these moves have very similar kinetic sequencing as far as, hip, knee, and ankle. People like to talk about triple extension a lot. And even though in
Yeah,
sports we don't always reach that triple extension, I think it's still a very important aspect of a lot of athletic movements. And so, in general, I think it's not necessarily so much for me as how a move transfers just because it looks similar. Because I think
hmm,
sport movements are done at a very different velocity altogether in a more
yeah,
chaotic setting. But to me, I think it's all about just the neurological adaptations. If you can get the nervous system to understand that it is safe to load each limb
yeah.
maximally, not to kind of shut down in order to protect your stability and to protect you from possible damage. I think that will transfer to athletic performance because then you'll just be able to display the type of performance that you want once you've kind of taken care of these weaknesses.
Exactly. And for example, when we execute a very heavy bilateral lift, for example, also a squat, so the stabilizing muscles are working, but also we have the smaller muscles that they are often overseen. So when we switch to unilateral execution, so often neglected muscles like gluteus medius per se in a lunge becomes like a force generator. So why is deliberately strengthening these stabilizing muscles so crucial for long-term maximal bilateral strength? So is it this like directly correlated to actually extend also the strength with the bilateral movement for heavy lift?
Well, I just look at it as everybody is as strong as their weakest link, and you can have a situation where athletes are able to compensate very well for having certain muscles, like you said, not necessarily fully shut down because like muscles never
Yeah,
really shut down, but just
yeah,
not contributing nearly as much as they can be. And when you're kind of neglecting certain muscle groups, then what happens is other muscles tend to take over, and in the
yeah.
long term that might lead to more compensations, that might lead to muscle strains, that might lead to early loss of athleticism and a host of other issues. And in the industry there was a lot of talk about being hip dominant versus knee dominant, how important it is to generate power from the hips. But I've also seen the
Yeah.
reverse, where an athlete can't do like even on a machine, without even going to like a Bulgarian split squat, they can't even do like a single leg extension with any kind of meaningful weight, even though they can squat a whole
Yeah.
ton. So that right there means that there's some weaknesses there, but especially in the areas like glute medius, I think it can be a very important stabilizer at the high volume, high load, high velocity environment of most competitive sports.
Great. So that's awesome because it leads us to the second topic that is very curious about. So, for example, when an athlete presents with a very significant strength discrepancy, for example, say about 10% difference between the right and the left leg during any kind of form of a single leg execution. It doesn't matter what does it have to be during the fitness assessment testing. So what's your immediate first step? Do you simply load the weaker side more, or is there a period of corrective work and reduced load just necessary for you to do before you even begin to progressively overload and put your athletes towards looking forward? I mean,
Well, so
to
in
develop.
general, I want to do everything to expose the weakest side where it has no chance to hide. But I think a good starting point here would be not necessarily just loading it right away,
Yeah.
but again, just working through the positioning aspect. Lately I've been delving more into extreme isometrics from the J Schroeder system, for example, where you might get
Mm-hmm.
into a deep lunge position and you're trying to pull deeper in that position as opposed to just holding it isometrically. So it's a very,
Mm-hmm.
very slow contraction. So in the lunge of a front leg hamstring, while the front leg quad slowly stretches, and then the back leg is extended as much as you can, and you keep extending it very slowly. So that kind of teaches the muscles to fire appropriately in relation to each other. So they're firing at the same rate, lengthening and shortening, and
Yeah.
it's gonna really fire a lot more motor units, because if you get into that position and you spend a long time in it, then all the compensations are kind of eventually going to burn out, and the body will be forced to recruit more motor units and start kind of fixing that type of deficit. And then I think from there, it might be appropriate to load one side with a little more reps than the other. But I think starting with the positioning aspect is really important. Maybe even start with a conventional yielding isometric,
Yeah.
especially if athletes just coming back from injury, that could be really important. And then go into more of a extreme isometric just to see where they can pull deeper into that position and strengthen their end ranges, which I think will go a long way in terms of the later work that we can do, whether it's strength or plyometrics or anything else.
Yeah, just practically following the law of triphasical training. So going through all of the three phases. So, but I
In
mean,
some ways,
so
yes.
for example, what about for the listeners, for the people out there who are training in home environment, where the gyms practically or maybe some other equipment are limited? So, what would be, in your opinion, for example, give me 2 or 3 most versatile pieces of equipment that you would recommend for them to prioritize in their own training routine to maximize their effectiveness and liability when it comes to unilateral movement? What
Well,
would it be?
if you want to just talk about loading in the weight room, then I think a Smith
Mm,
machine can go a really long way, because it pretty much takes care of some of the stability demands and just allows you to purely load as much weight as you possibly can without having the nervous system kind of shut down and worry about what are you going to do if the weight's too heavy. Where do you drop the barbell? If you got your rear leg elevated, for example, you can't really
yeah,
drop the barbell back. It might be hard to drop it forward. Not everyone's comfortable with a front rack or a Zercher squat position because of maybe
yeah,
limiting factors of core stability, etc. So I think a Smith machine is really good for pure loading. I also have used at various times just some resistance bands, so I can do like a like a TKE terminal knee extension Bulgarian split squat, for example. So
yeah,
wrap it around the front leg, wrap it around some post, get a good tension on that band, and you can kind of bias the quad a little bit, the VMO maybe a little bit more so. Um,
yeah,
and then from there, I think it's just really anything can be used as load, but you just have to be aware of your positioning again, and having a way to safely progress it without compromising technique, and not going too far to where you're reaching technical failure before your set's complete, for example. But Smith machine and resistance bands, I think, can go a long way.
Yeah, especially because they have those demands pulling you actually in two different directions at the same time because of that non-stop continuously resistance that actually is applicable with them. But beyond just loading one leg or arm, so what is the unique, maybe a neurological demand that a single limb training places on the central nervous system, by your opinion? So is it just simply more challenging, or are there different motor patterns being reinforced? So can you, clear this out to the audience?
Yeah, I think a lot of the magic is not only in that working limb, but also what happens on the what you would typically consider to be the non-working side, because you have to obviously stabilize the core, you have to stabilize the pelvis.
Yeah,
If you're talking about like upper body work, like unilateral bench, it has to be a lot of shoulder stability and things like that. So I think when you're getting the nervous system to be looking at all these different elements, that is definitely a much higher challenge on it, because it has to coordinate that really, really fast. So I think a lot of times,
yeah,
even when you're doing a movement relatively slow and controlled, there is a lot of things that are happening extremely quickly within the nervous system. So you're not just moving load; you're really just reinforcing efficiency and the neuromuscular coordination. Whereas in a
yeah,
bilateral lift, the nervous system might get so efficient that it will just kind of offload certain things to the stronger muscle groups, and it won't be really forced to work as hard, because it unfortunately always looks for the path of least resistance. It ultimately doesn't care much about performance. It cares more about survival. But if you can show your nervous system a way to engage maximally and force it to fire more motor units, to engage more muscle fibers, and through that training ultimately show it that high performance is safe, then that's going to go a
yeah.
long way in terms of increasing athleticism.
Yeah, that's for sure. But I also have noticed that many coaches out there are using unilateral training sessions specifically to enhance the anti-rotation and anti-lateral flexions and just strengthening those parts. But can you also elaborate a little bit deeper on that in strength stability demands of, let's say, a heavy single arm row or a Bulgarian split squat per se, because it's often used also in the gyms, and why that carries over so powerfully to that bilateral performance afterwards? What do you think?
Hmm. Yeah, so I think that in general, you do want to train the core every way that it's supposed to work. So you do have to have like lateral flexion, rotation,
Yeah,
flexion, extension, and you also have to be able to stabilize against that. So first of all, I think just not necessarily looking at it at first in terms of the bilateral lift, but just in terms of sports performance, you have to have sudden stabilization demands. Like if you are, driving the lane in basketball and you're trying to finish through contact, that's more of a sudden kind of stabilization that has to happen. And I think
yeah,
the unilateral lifts would transfer very well to that, especially if you're starting to move heavy loads with max intent. So it's not just about the fact that the opposing limbs have to stabilize. It's about the fact that they have to stabilize relatively quickly and learn how to do that. But it would definitely create a lot more core integrity overall, which would transfer well to the bilateral lifts as well. I think because a lot of times in the bilateral lifts, like you said, one side can be biased a little bit more, and you might not
yeah.
notice certain small things like maybe a subtle lean forward or back or to the side. But here you can really lock in on these things and kind of reteach the nervous system to like, okay, that here's this part of the body, here's that part of the body, here's how we can use it.
Awesome. And this is where actually is much more crucial when it comes to also the injury prevention. I think that we as a coaches, we can't talk seriously about strength and conditioning nowadays without talking about longevity. I think this must be a priority to our athletes. But in your experience, how critical is dedicated unilateral work in identifying and correcting asymmetries and those muscular imbalances. And as such, for example, this mitigating to non-contact injury risk, how would you apply it also to transfer it eventually to the sport?
Yeah, I think it's really important to use unilateral training there as far as injury prevention because if you look at what they do in rehab, they obviously want to expose the injured limb that they have just maybe performed surgery on to the maximum to where it just can't hide and it is forced to do the work. First loading it slowly, then loading it more dynamically to handle the ground forces of the sport. So when you look at that in terms of rehab, then in some ways you kind of want to do rehab before you get injured. Maybe obviously
Yep.
in a slightly different setting of intensity and programming, but generally like there's a scale between rehab and performance. And late stages rehab is already kind of performance training, so you might as well just try to prevent that by trying to isolate each limb and try to find these imbalances because a lot of elite athletes are very good at compensating their movements. And if you look at some top sprinters, some top athletes in combat sports, team sports, etc., they may not move the same way that coaches would teach conventional technique, but they're maybe just very, very good at compensating movement, and that eventually is going to rear its ugly head sooner or later, whether it's an injury or a loss of athleticism that happens too early. So I think doing that kind of unilateral work, working on their proper positioning and mechanics can go a long way in preventing that.
Awesome. And maybe you can clear this out also for all the coaches and athletes out there who are also like trying to build this kind of training session into their own training block. So where do you think and where do you strategically place these unilateral movements within the session? So are they best utilized for you as an accessory work after the main bilateral lift, or do they ever stand as a primary movement for a given training day? So what is your case scenario here?
I think it will depend a lot on an athlete. So if I have somebody who is a veteran who has a very nice strength base already, I would
Mm-hmm.
probably limit just the bilateral lifts because I wouldn't want to necessarily actually load them too much with a barbell
Yeah.
and things like that. I would prefer just a different means of loading in some unilateral work. And for veterans, it would probably be more important to address these types of imbalances because they're not necessarily trying to build like raw numbers, raw horsepower. More so, they already know how to play their sport very well, and they just want to maintain, let's say, their role on a team. Or if they're a combat athlete, they already know which style they're going to fight. They just want to maintain that as opposed to doing something that's more risky and just trying to increase the vertical jump speed and all those other qualities. So in
Yeah.
that case, I would just go with a unilateral exercises, and I could pretty much find a way to build that into whatever training calendar I have them on, whether it's preseason going into in season or full off season or whatever the case may be. With younger athletes, I would have them do bilateral work, and then I would have them do some single leg work as an accessory. Maybe on that same day, so obviously lower volume, but more focus on positioning, control. Maybe I would go, with like a 5 second eccentric lower, a little bit of a hold at the bottom, or even,
Yeah.
eccentric into isometric into a quick concentric, or like I said, just a pure isometric or iso extreme, something like that. So it would ultimately depend on the athlete, but I wouldn't be trying to just push squat numbers just because, for me, it would be more about movement efficiency, how fast the bar is moving and their maximum intent.
Okay, that is awesome. But for example, and I also very a big, huge believer to the periodization, and within the progressive overload. For me, it's very like a law in a strength and conditioning. But um, it's a fundamentally different to load, for example, a Bulgarian split squat versus a normal back squat. And how do you practically define and execute that progressive overload in a way that is maybe measurable, safe, but also sustainable for a long term to make that appropriate adjustments and actually develop your athlete?
Well, I think at the early stages, like I said, I would be all about the control of the movement. So I would go maybe with a
Yeah,
slower eccentric, especially if we're talking off-season phases where they don't have a lot of practices in their sport or games, or they don't have a fight coming up really soon. So they can afford a little bit more fatigue from that eccentric phase, maybe even a little bit more soreness, but they can really lock in
yeah,
that control. Generally, when it comes to progressive overload, I used to think that it's just all about, okay, if we can add, half a kilo, 1 kilo, 2 kilo, 5 kilos every week, then that's progressive overload. But the way I look at it now is you can also look at the efficiency of movement. How is that movement controlled? So that's not necessarily going to be measurable. It's going to be a little bit more about the coach's eye. If you do have things
yeah.
like various velocity trackers, things like that, you can definitely try to measure the speed with which the athlete moves. Obviously, a little bit harder doing a single leg than would be on a double leg, but still possible. And
Yeah.
so, as long as the athlete is staying with the same weight but can move that weight faster, can have more control, doesn't have a lot of like wobble or knee collapsing, for example, in a split squat and things like that, then I think we're still definitely doing progressive overload before we go to more sets, more reps, more weight.
Awesome. And is there any specific periodization model? We know we have many different ones. For example, a linear periodization, undulating periodization, cluster model, block model. And how does the role of also the unilateral training shifts for you across those various phases of a periodization model? For example, is there a purely volume-based and a hypertrophy work in a general preparation phase for you? Or is there also a work that you can also asset to do a maximal strength effort also with a single limb work in a specific picking phase? Or how actually would you structure that throughout the? Is there any specific periodization model that you trust the most?
Mhm. Well, in a lot of sports that I deal with a lot of team sports. It's hard to execute
Mhm.
any kind of a pure periodization model because a lot of times there are different constraints, such as maybe a shorter off season than you would like,
Yeah,
or an athlete needing to maybe try out for a different team to get a contract for next year, or
yeah,
maybe they're just trying to rehab and things like that. But generally, in like a GPP phase, I could just do some kind of hypertrophy work with single limb work, and then use those same exercises later for more of a strength oriented approach, to where maybe I would change things like obviously sets and reps, but also I might just change the tempo, maybe even go to just concentric only type of a setup more towards the beginning of their season. So I think
yeah,
one exercise can really be used across the different periodization phases. I do like, and generally, I do like the kind of undulating models more. I think they work very well, especially for combat athletes, because you can easily mix and match it with the type of technical striking practices and sparring sessions that they have, to where you can really calculate when to drive intensity, when to back off. Making the hardest days absolutely hardest as they can be, and then having some light days as well for some much needed recovery work and things like that. But I think I can plug in unilateral work and even the same exercise across a wide variety of these type of models.
yeah. And I love it that you're using the unilateral work in the undulating periodization model, because I read the recent paper where it comes with those conclusion that undulating periodization model is practically the best for just having the long-term gains and just sustainable increase in the performance output. So it's because I think it's just guessing and also keep our nervous system even more engaged throughout the whole year period. So it doesn't matter throughout the periodization model where you have to hit your peak performance with your athlete. So if you're just keep involving in the undulating periodization model, you're just gonna, I think, take this 2 or 3% even more from out of your athlete. So this is very great. But if an athlete, for example, primary goal is to increase the weight, let's go just basically in a bilateral deadlift. So what might be, in your case scenario, the top 2 or even 3 unilateral exercises that you would prescribe or give to this athlete, and what specifically carry over are you that you were seeking in it from each one in order to accord this goal?
Well, first of all, I would go with single leg RDL probably, and I could do
Yeah.
a variety of different ways of loading it. I would prefer something like a barbell or even a Smith machine, again, just to eliminate the kind of stability demands as a limiting factor
Yeah.
and really push the weight, because that's not going to be that much of a limiting factor like in a bilateral deadlift. Or and even maybe using stuff like not like maybe a true super maximal eccentric, but some type of eccentric overload where maybe you're lifting with 2 legs and then you're lowering with one to create that eccentric strength, which is real important. Um, I also think that using a Bulgarian split squat here would be appropriate, and maybe having the front foot elevated on the platform so they can go in, so
Mm-hmm.
a little bit of like a deficit setup to really strengthen the end ranges there. You can also use that exercise to bias quads or glutes or whatever you want. So I would maybe bias the glutes a little bit more there. And also something like a single arm row, I think would work great because it would work on stabilizing the back, which is real important in deadlifts. And I think just this selection of accessories could transfer pretty well.
Awesome. And I think that even nowadays, we can see the elite level athletes are having the practical ceiling of their performance, how much load they can safely manage unilaterally because of those differences. But when would you recommend to the coaches, to the people out there, to the athletes, to shift those stimulus from maybe a purely external load to the manipulation of maybe like you said, a volume, doing more time under tension, or just staking this ability just to improve that capabilities?
Well, I think for each athlete, it's going to be a little bit different, and it all just comes down to kind of. I don't remember who said it first, but one coach put it very well. Like every time you strength train in general, you're putting a little bit of money in the bank, but you're also
Yeah,
being taxed a certain amount in terms of fatigue and in terms of the time you put in. So if you're a beginner and you're doing a lot of strength training, then you put a lot of money in the bank and the tax is relatively small. But the more advanced you get and the more weight overall you can push, whether it's unilateral or bilateral, then the less you put in the bank and the more you get taxed. So you kind of don't ever want to
yeah,
go into the negative there. And I'm not a fan of slow and grinding reps just to get a little bit more weight on the bar by any means, because I
yeah,
think that that kind of dampens the nervous system response for fast, twitchy, and dynamic activities of sports. So I think when an athlete has naturally reached a level where they really, really have to grind and just absolutely kill themselves for just like an extra half a kilo to a kilo, I would probably stop progressing just the weight, and then I might look into things like, okay, maybe we can move the same weight faster. We can play
yeah,
around with tempos. Maybe we can start doing accommodating resistance, chains, bands, things like that. Or maybe just throw in a variation. So if they were doing, Smith machine, Bulgarian split squat, let's see what they can do on a Zercher. Maybe the overall load would be different, but
mm,
it's going to also provide a different stimulus for the nervous system. It's going to give a little bit more as far as the core control, things like that. Maybe even go with a more athletic variation. I'm not necessarily a fan of having like the heel off the ground in terms of lifting, but throwing it in once in a while, like a Bulgarian split squat with the heel off the platform, for example, can build maybe a little bit more sport specific adaptations. The absolute load again will be less, but it will be a new movement that will be challenging the nervous system. So you won't be
yeah.
accumulating just that enormous fatigue from absolute load. There will be extra fatigue just because it's a new movement. But I think playing with variations like that and using accommodating resistance strategically can be beneficial.
Awesome. I love it. And what do you think that nowadays are coaching making the huge mistakes when it comes to planning this kind of periodization model in a unilateral form? Do you think that's practically even like more just like in a sense of making a normal a volume? Is it like also like you said, a tempo-driven exercises, the external load, or just simply programming not enough in their training sessions? What do you think that those coaches nowadays are making the most mistakes of it?
Well, I think generally creating any program is like a recipe. So if somebody tells you, you can use dates to make some very nice paste for the brownies, that's not really enough because you need to know how much of that paste to put in, how many other ingredients to put in, and how they all mix together. So I think
Yeah,
it just kind of becomes a juggling of variables. I think a lot of coaches may just want to throw in either too much work in there, in which case I would suggest they actually try to do the plan that they wrote for the athlete and see how that feels. Or it might be just the opposite, where they treat like unilateral work as kind of an afterthought and just throwing it in there just because somebody said you have to do it. Let's just kind of put it in there to check a box. So maybe it's
yeah,
the weight's too light, maybe too many reps without really driving strength adaptations. Or but the biggest thing to me is I think is just intent. So I think if you can have like just a couple of exercises but perform with maximum intent, then
yeah.
it will
The
go a
muscle mind
long way.
connection.
Yeah, exactly.
That's great. And we heard today a lots of benefits and that you discussed and also explained it to us. But even you as a coach, if you can distill your own philosophy based throughout the year that you gained as a coach, what would it be? Can you make it like just a one sentence? What would be just um, the pure input that you would give it to your younger self or even to the younger generation out there who are just trying to be like you were trying to reach their best possible version of themselves?
Yeah, I think generally I like to look at the fact that ultimately, it's the nervous system that drives everything. So the nervous system ultimately decides how much force it sends into a muscle, how fast that contraction is, and things like that. So I think if you start looking at everything you do, not from the standpoint of maybe gaining a certain adaptation, but more so from getting access to what is already there, because we've all heard stories.
Yeah.
Some tourist goes on an African safari, starts getting chased by a hippo, never trained in his life. All of a sudden, he's running like Usain Bolt, right? So the nervous
Yes.
system can give you that access if it's a fight or flight survival mechanism. And so when it comes to performance, I think it's just getting more access to what's already there, showing the nervous system that, okay, here's your one leg, here's how we're loading it. It is safe to do it, and that means that it will give you more and more access. So a lot of that I think is just it's not looking at it. Okay, I'm going to get nice and strong, and that will automatically solve all the problems. Just looking at the neurological issue, how everything is interconnected, and ultimately going from the nervous system outwards, kind of building athletes from the inside out rather than trying to build them from the outside in.
Awesome, Ivan. And thanks. We are just actually practically at the end of this interview. And thank you for sharing your really deep experience and expertise to the Let's Get Moving podcast. It's practically clearly that integration of that unilateral training is just something that is not just nice to have, but it's very significant and importance that we need to have this structural, sustainable strength and conditioning programming. And just before we wrap this up, for the listeners out there who want to follow your work, where they can find you.
Yeah, so I do a lot of workout breakdowns of professional athletes on my Instagram. That's iaz.training.
All right.
And I do long form content, kind of diving into more details on my YouTube, which is Enlightened Athlete. So enlightened underscore athlete, where I also do a lot of podcasts with other coaches and do long form content, maybe breaking down a particular training system or just, giving some exercises that athletes can and should incorporate into their training. So these are kind of my main outlets on social media, and the Telegram channel IAZ_training for more of my written content, a little bit more of my philosophy and things like that.
Awesome. And without further ado, I'm just going to tell to the audience, and I'm going to put all of the links into the description down below. And Ivan, thanks once again for sharing your expertise to my channel. It's a great pleasure and honor to have you. And of course, I'm really looking forward to cooperating and working with you in the future. So, and to the audience, please like, share, and subscribe for more content like this, because this is just the beginning of Let's Get Moving community. So stay tuned. And
Ivan,
bye-bye.
thanks very much for having me. It was a lovely conversation. Looking forward to talking to you again in the future.
Thank you, my friend. Thank you. So, all right, we can cut it right now.